What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of The Jungle. This would be episode 6, and I am very honored and thankful to have my guest on today, Mrs. Danielle Giles, right? That's how I say your last name. I should have asked you that.
Giles.
Giles? Okay. So Danielle is a very good friend of my sister's, and she works in the juvenile justice system as a mental health counselor. So I wanted to kind of have Danielle on and just kind of talk about some issues that are going on as far as early development, kind of what she sees on her end of things. And because like you guys know, like I've stated before, the whole point of this podcast is to bring to light some issues that are going on in the system and to give you guys an overall view of kind of what it's like, what people deal with day in and day out. I've said I've got a whole plethora of people that are coming on here that work throughout the system, that have been through the system. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mrs. Danielle.
Me.
What's that?
Thanks for having me.
Oh, for sure. All right, so I'm just going to get into basically what is your role in the juvenile court system?
Yeah, so I'm a clinical counselor. So I work with kids any level of the system. So it can be kids probation, just in the diversion program, or actually in the detention center. So I do just regular counseling with them, and then I can also go to court with them and kind of advocate for them with their probation officers or the judge or really anybody involved in the court.
Okay. So what made you get into this? Was there any specific reason, any like event when you were younger or growing up?
I mean, the reason I got into counseling was because I think working with juveniles and working with kids who really don't have a voice. So I specifically kind of wanted to work with kids in counseling and try to help them through their issues and kind of specifically the court system. I never had any sort of court involvement, but I just kind of wanted to be in a place where I felt like I could do kind of the most good. And I think these kids are a lot of times forgotten about or just written off as, oh, they're bad kids. So they don't really get the help they need. So I really wanted to kind of dive in and kind of be able to actually help kids that don't generally get that, I guess.
Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, it's funny because the more I talk to people on here, it's almost a common issue, even in the adult system, that it's kind of like there's not enough people like yourself to advocate for and to understand to make sense of what's actually going on,
Right.
and why people do what they do. And so I mean, I've been through counseling for years, and they've advocated for me. They've gone to court with me. They've helped me through a lot of my issues, and I think that was a big benefactor in my success. But I don't think there's enough of it. I know you guys are stretched thin. I mean, with any government agency, that they're all just stretched very thin. So, what does a normal day for you look like? Is it just one-on-one time? Are you in and out of the juvenile detention center a lot?
Yeah, so my office is on like the court side of our building, and our court is just connected to the detention center. So I can go pretty much back to detention 3 times a day if I needed to. But generally I'll try to keep my detention kids like in the morning because they're obviously back there and free anytime essentially. And then I'll do my kind of outpatient probation and diversion kids in the afternoon. So I kind of have a good balance of being in detention center and then being back in my office. Sometimes there's meetings and whatnot, but it's a pretty typical day.
Okay. So I know a lot of people that are going to listen to this, they don't know what it's like. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know what it's like inside of a juvenile detention center. I was fortunate enough. I didn't get in trouble until about midway through my 20s. So I never got to frequent the juvenile hall. What's the atmosphere like in there? Is it, because like I know for me when I got locked up, like initially in county, I was locked down for 23 hours a day as like I'm assuming, and you may be able to actually verify, as like a observation to see how I'm going to react. But then prison, it was kind of the same way. I was locked down 23-1 for a while. What's the day like, and what's the atmosphere like in the juvenile detention center?
So it is very, I would say, than the adult system because these kids are still, they're going to school, they do groups, they do like gym time. So they're still doing some of the kind of regular kid things. So the boys, the first thing they do is gym class in the morning. So they do the gym and then they go to kind of their regular classes. We have a counselor back in the detention center who runs groups on like anger management and different stuff like that. And then they have like structured leisure time, which could be, sometimes it's things like they're playing cornhole or ping pong, stuff like that, or doing TV, or sometimes they're just reading or writing and stuff like that. So I would say it definitely is very different from the adult system. They're not locked down all the time. There are certain times where they might be on isolation for some reason, but that might be because they were violent and they're trying to, you know, protect them from other kids or whatnot. But no, they have a relatively busy day. They have like AA meetings, like I think one night a week. They have a Bible group that comes in. They keep them pretty busy, I think.
Okay. So I am going to jump off on a tangent just for a moment because I want to ask you a question that just honestly came to my mind. So obviously adult recidivism rates, like at 80, I think it's 87, 89% of offenders go back to prison within 10 years of coming out. And then I sent you some statistics last night that I wanted to touch base on because it looks like from 97, where there was about 180,000 kids incarcerated every day, that number's dropped like almost, I think, 60 some percent. It's down into like the 40,000s. Now, I understand like the European criminal justice system and overseas systems, they're very different from the United States because they kind of do what you guys are doing on the juvenile level. So like over in Europe with adults, you're in dorms and you're taught a skill. You're made to go to meetings. You're made to go to therapy. You're made to go to all of these things. So they are actually like rehabilitating offenders, which it sounds like you guys are doing on the juvenile level, which I'm going to assume, and I'll let you talk on it for a minute. Is that potentially why you feel the rates in juveniles have dropped so massively as far as incarceration goes?
I would say yes, at least where I'm at, our judge says a lot. Like juvenile court is about rehabilitation versus punishment. Like we don't send a lot of kids to kid prison. We try to send them more to treatment. So maybe residential treatment to work on trauma or just get them into counseling or keep them at the probation level before actually locking them up. So we are trying to rehabilitate and help them before being like, we're throwing you away and you're just punished forever.
Yeah. That's a huge I never understood that. And I think I've mentioned this in every one of my episodes so far. You had, and actually Joe Biden just outlawed the prisons for profits on a state level or privatized prisons for profit. Lake Erie, where I was at, it was the first. It was kind of like a test run to see how it operated on the state level because CCA of America actually ran a bunch of federal level prisons, but it went from programs in the prison that you can get involved with and AA and churches and all these activities you can get involved with where all the funding was axed because now there's this we want to make money. So I think it's great, and I think that Biden outlawed that. That's a great thing. But I also, I think the overarching topic here should be there needs to be rehabilitation. There needs to be programs for people to get into. That's the only way that the recidivism rate will drop. So just to get a little down and dirty, nitty gritty, tell me like maybe what's the most violent thing you've seen in the juvenile hall, or what's the craziest thing you've seen up there or been a witness to?
I gotta be honest, I don't personally see much of the violence happening. I've been shown certain things like on video if it's involving my kids, but nobody has been violent with me. There have been times like codes have been called when I'm back there, but I'm back there in a room alone with kids, so I'm not witnessing all the staff running to stop a fight.
Okay.
What there definitely have been certain assaults on staff and whatnot, but where our juvenile court is, we just don't get a lot of violent offenders, I would say, and they're generally pretty well behaved because they like their privileges in the detention center. So I think they know if they're being violent, they're going to be locked in their room. So I think they like to continue doing the gym, doing the different activities and whatnot. So I just don't think they're doing some of those things. But yeah.
Right. So it's not too crazy for you. I can only imagine. I mean, I can only imagine if like I said, if you have way less kids coming through, then obviously things seem to be working on your end. So I couldn't imagine you have a ton of violent offenders. What Tell me what's like a common denominator you see with some of these kids coming in? Is it alcohol and drug issues? Is it violence? Is it like theft? What's going on? And like what if you can talk about it, kind of what's the common denominator in those kids' home life? Like what do things look like for them?
A lot of times there's some sort of trauma, or some of these kids are in the foster system, or parents have been in and out of their lives. There's generally some sort of past trauma, unresolved something that's never been dealt with. So they're acting out in these ways, or they're always fighting with parents because parents are always yelling and screaming at them. And maybe they're turning to substance use for coping. I see that a lot, kind of mixed with kind of the trauma and the substance use piece. And then we're working with both of those. But really, I would say the common factor among pretty much all, some sort of trauma that has never been addressed. So then they get to the juvenile system and then we're like, holy cow, with all this. And you have charges because the trauma was never dealt with.
Yeah. So a lot of those, how often would you say those kids come? And I didn't pull the statistics on this, but how often would you say those kids that are coming through that you see? Well, do you have a percentage rate on how many of them come back into the adult system, or how many like reoffend when they're adults?
I don't right now. I've only been working where I'm at for like a year and 2 months.
Oh, okay.
Any of that. Had some kids who turned 18, or I have one kid who turned 18 and has already had adult charges. But that was, we tried to get him in other services and he wasn't following through. And at that point, you are an adult. So I can't force you
Yeah.
to do counseling. So, but yeah, so I guess it's been one so far.
Okay. Um, so let's talk a little bit about, let me see here. Let's talk a little bit about how do you, it's got to be stressful coming. So you see all these kids that are obviously broken. They have trauma. They're not broken, but they've been through trauma. They've been through traumatic situations. What do you do to kind of like leave your job, separate your job from your home life? Because that's got to be hard. I know.
Yeah. I mean, some of these kids, especially if I really connect with them, I really like, I either relate to their stories or just really want to like get them out of a situation or whatever. It is hard. Like I do think about them at home sometimes, but I think what helps one is just good coworkers. Like I can go vent to people. I think we have a really good group of people and we all work with pretty much the same kids. So just kind of talking things through, doing something at nights to kind of relax and to kind of de-stress from work, which might be like running or going to a friend's or something like that. But really, I think it is just more the coworkers and being able to talk to them and talk through some of these things. Cause it is hard.
Yeah.
But
No, that's got to be tough. And I know I have a huge heart for kids, and especially kids that are going through situations. When I came home, my attorney actually reached out to me after I'd been home for, it was probably about a year. And I won't mention his name, but he reached out and he's like, "Hey, will you talk to so and so? Hey, we talk." And I see these little gang kids out in the neighborhood. And they're like, and they're just doing stupid shit. And I try to put myself back in the mindset of those kids and what I was like when I was a kid running around causing trouble. And I'm like, they're not going to listen. They're going to do it their way. Kids are hard headed. But yeah, man, I've always had a huge just heart for kids, and that was another reason I wanted to have you on. So,
yeah.
So there were two topics I kind of wanted to touch on, just and go into depth a little bit about. So, obviously, you're in this field because you care a lot about kids, and but one thing that has skyrocketed outside of the decrease in kids coming through the system is suicide. It's
Yeah.
teenage suicide, and I'm sure in your position, you probably hear more times than none, um,
Right.
the 4 words that nobody ever wants to hear. It's, I want to kill myself.
Right.
So, like, what do you think? Why do you think that there's been such a decrease in kids coming through for charges and being incarcerated, but the suicide rate has shot through the roof?
I mean, I personally feel like maybe social media and just kids being online and being connected all the time has some sort of effect on the suicide rates, because I mean, when there's cyberbullying and
Yeah.
extortion type stuff, like there's a lot of stuff going on now that wasn't happening, 10, 20, however many years ago. So I feel like that's a big factor. I mean, kids could be bullied any time of the day, any time of night, where before it was just at school. So like there's a lot more just being exposed to things that we didn't see years ago. And when kids are on social media and different apps and whatnot from like 5 years old, they're exposed from a very young age potentially to bullying, or they're comparing themselves to other people and whatnot. And that's really hard for a undeveloped brain to deal with.
Yeah.
And a lot of times parents don't necessarily know what their kids are seeing because kids are sneaky and whatnot. So they're not even knowing like, oh, my kid is seeing all these things or is being bullied online or whatever until it's too late.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge factor. I don't know that I can think of anything else at the moment.
Well, I do want to touch on everything you just said, because that's something I've had tons of conversations with people about that. I mean, obviously, my daughter. I mean, you're friends with my sister, so you know good old Nevaeh.
Yes.
And she is a social media warrior, like
Yes.
and a technology warrior, and she gets so bent out of shape, and she's so just wrapped up on, and I love her to death, and it drives me nuts. Like, there's times I have to call her and be like, dude, you need to chill. Like, what are you doing? But I think we live in an age where where it went from there being at least one parent in the household. We've gone from an age where, my family was, my dad went and worked,
Right.
my mom was a stay-at-home mom, but we didn't have technology, quote unquote, raising us.
Right.
And you introduce all these factors of like influencers that are these beautiful photoshopped pictures online that are completely unattainable,
Right.
unless you know what I mean? And you have these girls that feel inadequate. And then you have all this, you're just bombarded constantly with those dopamine hits and those, you know what I mean? And so I personally think that's one of the main issues as far as the suicide rate skyrocketing. I think you're absolutely right. I think the bullying, it's too easy for keyboard warriors to hop on and hide behind a screen and just be nasty. I've said before, I'm a truck driver. I get in some of these Facebook truck driving groups, and it's like the scum of the earth comes out in the comment sections. These guys they are ruthless. I got another buddy that does a podcast. His name's Mike Lombard, and I've been on his show, and we've kind of talked a little bit about this. And we will literally sit and we'll follow these threads, and then we'll be messaging each other on the side, and we're like, dude, what's wrong with society? And I legitimately think society is broken at the level of its heart, or the compassion, or like America's heart's just broken.
Yes.
And I think it's pouring over into our kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you see that on a daily basis.
Right. Well, and I've had kids tell me, not only are they being possibly bullied by random strangers on the internet, but there are Snapchat groups from kids at their school where they are being constantly put down and whatnot. Just they're seeing it. And a lot of times their parents are also on their phones all the time, maybe not paying attention, or they're just kind of yelling or whatever. So parents might be there, but they're not helping with this situation, not checking on. Yeah, they're present, but not really paying attention a lot of times. They're into the same technology a lot.
Yeah.
So
no, I think it's been technology has definitely been a double-edged sword. It's there are times that I just shut everything off. Like I'll come home on a Friday and I'm like, I don't want to touch a screen, look at even a TV screen, because I almost feel it almost gets me to a point where I feel fried. Like
Yeah.
it's so much like sensory overload. I'm like, I just feel fried from everything being like in my face constantly.
Right.
Um, so I can only imagine, and that's why I kind of understand. I understand like Nevaeh and why she acts out the way she does because and not necessarily acts out. She's a great kid, but
Right.
I get it. Like the bullying and everything else. I mean, I get calls all week. Deanna gets calls all week. This girl's texting me this, and there's this on, and they're saying this, and I'm like, Nevaeh, I'm like, just walk away from it. But it's hard to do.
Pay attention. But yeah, as a teenager, they can't just shut that down. If they're being
Yeah,
picked on, they just go with that. They don't think about, well, their opinion of me doesn't matter. Like they don't think that way.
yeah,
So it's gonna get to them and then they're gonna possibly freak out or whatever, but it's normal for teenagers to do, you know?
yeah. So outside of you dealing with just kids inside of the criminal justice system, the juvenile system, do you deal with any other kids or or is that your entire caseload is just kids going through the criminal justice system?
So I'll occasionally get somebody that's just like their parents are dealing with a custody case or something, but the kid's not in trouble. There's just maybe some sort of barrier to getting them counseling. So I'll see a few younger kids that are just seeing me because they need counseling related to kind of their parents' issues. But that's maybe only like 3 out of my 30 kids. So it's pretty much kids that are either in the detention center or on probation or in the diversion program. So most of them are actually going through the system.
Now, to go back, like just to kind of what it's like back in the detention center, is it kind of free movement? Is it like a dorm setting? Is it
Now, so it's still, so yes, they have their classrooms and gym and all that, but they're always with a detention officer. If they're out of their rooms, they're always with a detention officer. So
okay?
um, they have like their pod room that has kind of different tables and whatnot, and that's where they do their kind of leisure time. So at that point, depending on how many kids, there's always 1 or 2 DOs in there. But yeah, so even if they're going to the bathroom, like they're being walked with a DO. And if I'm grabbing a kid, there needs to be a DO with me. Like
Yeah.
it's so they're buddy. Yeah, so not really free movement. I guess in the gym, kind of they're running around and whatnot, but there's still officers in there.
Okay. What this is kind of my last topic, and then if there's anything you want to touch on, I'd love to have a discussion about it. But the teen, I feel like teen dating and sexual violence has kind of increased as well, along the decrease in the people coming through, and that's just why these numbers are weird to me. Like I'm looking them up, and I'm like, what's going on in this area where these like the suicide rate and homicide rate amongst kids is skyrocketing, not necessarily skyrocketing, I shouldn't use that term, but there's been an increase. Teen dating and sexual violence among teens there's been an increase. The one sheet on the statistical data, I'm sorry, it's like freezing in here. I'm in my sunroom. I'm like chattering. But it shows like the kids, it shows the number of kids who are most likely to report it. It's like the freshman is very low. They're not willing to report stuff that goes on. Sophomores, it gets a little higher, and then it's like up through seniors. Seniors are like, yeah. What do you attribute like all of the, or is there anything you can attribute to it from talking to your kids? Do you deal with kids that have charges like this?
Yeah, I kind of see both sides. Like I have some kids who have been sexually assaulted, and then I have some kids who actually have like rape charges or like sexual assault charges. I do wonder again if some of it is more like phone use and whatnot. Kids are connecting more, so I feel like that kind of has an increase in the dating and whatnot because you
Yeah.
can reach 12 people at one time if you want to. You can be seeing a whole bunch of people at once versus again like before maybe you had to ask your parent to call the friend or call the person you're dating.
You had to get on the wall phone with the 30-foot cord and walk into the kitchen
Right.
to ask mom.
Yeah. So a lot of times like kids are dating or doing something with someone else when parents don't even know about it. They might not be allowed to like date. But again, they're connecting over their phones and whatnot. So I think it's just they're meeting people more often. I have kids that have said they've been on dating apps and whatnot. I'm like, that's not appropriate. So I guess in terms of like the not reporting things, I mean, one, that's scary if you're, 12, 13, 14 years old. Um, Nobody really wants to have to like relive that story. Like if I report
Yeah.
this, I have to go to court and then testify against this kid. I've been in a few, I guess, courtrooms like that, and it is very hard for that kid to have to talk about this is what happened to me in front of their, the person that victimized them. So I think, I mean, that's I think a big thing for, I would say, especially young girls, is they don't want to have to go confront their perpetrator. That's very scary. And then a lot of times it's a he said, she said type situation, and nobody wants to not be believed.
Well, I have to be honest too. I mean, watching and looking at some of these court cases where there has been a rape or something of that nature, sexual assault. It's wild to me how often the defendant, well, we'll call him a defendant. I'm trying to find lack of better terms.
Yeah.
Is kind of like, and I get it. The court system has to be evenly balanced. I understand that, but there has been situations where I've watched videos and it's like there is no way this didn't happen, and the court kind of still side. It's like the amount of evidence that's needed to convict somebody of that. And I
Right.
get it. Like I can understand, because in this day and age, you also have, playing devil's advocate, you have the other side of it where girls get mad and they accuse their ex-boyfriend of hurting them.
Right.
Um, but it's just wild to me how hard it is to. It's just a very slippery slope, I think, on both ends. Um, so yeah, it's. Do you well, you said you see both ends of it. So, what do you think? Is there any way? What do you think the main goal would be in all that? What do you think a band-aid could be, or is there one?
Whew. I mean, obviously, like we kind of already touched on this, like we try to rehabilitate these kids. So even kids with these rape charges or kind of harder charges, we do still try to rehabilitate. Like we try to get them specific treatment for their behaviors and whatnot, and those sorts of thought processes and whatnot. But some of these kids just, they're not going to change. Unfortunately, so I don't know that there's really a solution. Like I think we need better treatments for sexual offenders, and I don't know what that would look like. And I think like we need to find a way to, I don't know, get people more comfortable with actually coming forward when they're victimized, I guess. But I don't know that that will change either, because you're right. Like these things, you go into the courtroom and a lot of times they take the side of the perpetrator or whatever. So people are never always going to come forward, I guess. And then they're maybe not going to get the help they need because they're not talking about what even happened to them. So I don't know that there's Band-Aid. I think there's a lot of things that need to happen. And I don't
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head. I know that was kind of like a trick question that I threw at you. I apologize, but me personally, the Band-Aid, I think the Band-Aid for society at this point is limited cell phone use. I mean, and it's never going to happen. Technology is just going to continue to increase exponentially until the end of time, until Terminator happens and it wipes us off the face of the earth. So, but I, but I really feel like we have it's been implemented into our lives at such a fast rate, and we rely on it so heavily that, I mean, I would say a lot of the sexual violence and teen, like the stuff like that, it's all being thrown in their face. It's sex. I open Instagram. I don't even follow females on Instagram, but I still open it, and it's like pushed. It's like suggested for you, and it's like, oh, Carrie J from Indiana, and it's all like ass. And I'm scrolling, and my wife's like, what is that? And I'm like, but it's just put in your face nonstop.
Yeah. Well, and even
So
phone use, kids have access to porn and stuff that they
yeah,
didn't have to go. So like they can get that at any time,
yeah.
like anytime. So Little tangent, I had a kid one time in the detention center. He told me he brought in a flash drive full of porn that he thought he was going to get to use in the detention center. Like, these kids just, they have so much more access to stuff, and they don't realize things like what you see on Instagram or videos or whatnot. Like, that's not the norm. Like, that's not how normal relationships should be. Like, that's not normal. But they're seeing it that way, so then they maybe do things based on what they've seen, and here we are.
Yeah, it's porn's a very slippery subject. What it does to what it does to matured brains, and especially the effect it has on developing brains is wild. Like, if you ever look at the research, it can potentially stunt the growth of an individual for
Right.
years, and people don't realize how bad. They just think they're going on clicking and watching a video, and they don't understand what it's actually doing to their brain, what it's doing to their emotional capabilities, their you know what I mean, their physical. I mean, it can physically affect you down the road. It can
Yeah.
get you to a point where it's wild. So and I think it is too easily accessible. I think that you're probably right. That's a big factor, I'm sure, in a lot of it. Is there any, so what is your main focus in, because you guys, I'm not going to say, you obviously are great at what you're doing. You're obviously making a change, because statistical data shows throughout the years since 97, it like basically it capped in 97, and it has been a steady decrease. And actually 2020 was the last statistical data that I could find. So I don't know what the last 3 years have shown, but you figure that was also COVID. That was also, I'm sure it's probably decreased a little bit more. It may have increased a little more, but what's your goal? I know you guys have a hard job. I know it's hard to take stuff that you probably hear and see home. So overall, what's your goal to continue as a mental health counselor?
Yeah, I mean, really, I just want to help these kids. The court's goal for me is obviously to like reduce recidivism and whatnot. Obviously, I like that as a goal too, but I mostly just want to be kind of a support for these kids who maybe have never had it in their lives, like be someone to listen when these kids haven't had that at times. So I mean, my main goal, I mean, it might sound cheesy again, is helping these kids that don't have that. But
I don't
and
think
I'm
that's cheesy at all.
doing
I don't think that's cheesy at all. No, so is there anything else you want to touch on? Is there anything that you've heard, seen, know about that might benefit listeners knowing? I mean,
um I mean, I don't really think so. I mean, other than just, I mean, with the juvenile system, we really do try to help the kids versus just punish them. I mean, there has to be kind of a balance. But we are trying to make things better for the kids and not just, throw them away. But,
yeah. Well, I will say, and I will make a comment on all this. Going back to, I think America's heart is just broken at this point. Anybody that's listening to this needs to understand that trauma is what causes 90% of shit across the board. You will typically, I mean, at some point maybe have some mental health issue that contributes to it, but statistically looking at data and going back through the numbers, 9 times out of 10, if you get the story behind what's actually happened, there's trauma involved. You have kids that are broken. You have kids that are broken that never get treatment, that go into adulthood, carrying all that trauma, carrying all that weight that's never been looked at or treated. And then you have these kids becoming adults and committing crimes. So I would actually encourage anybody that listens to this, if you know somebody that's going through something as a child, even as an adult, you take a step back and you think about one thing that I've started doing on all levels is, and I'm ashamed that I haven't done it up until I'm 40 years old, but I may have an opinion about something, but I'm always at this point trying to see the other person's perspective on things, trying to understand why they did what they did, trying to understand where they were at in their head when they did it. It's not, I always say nothing's black and white, no matter what you do. It's always gray. It might be a shade, it might be a darker shade of gray, it might be a lighter shade of gray, but there is no black and white. And I think society as a whole looks at kids in the criminal justice system and looks at adults in the criminal justice system, and they're like, well, it's black and white, right and wrong. You chose one, and they're right. You did choose one, but nobody
Right.
takes the time to look at what's in between there,
Right.
So
Why did they make that decision?
yeah. Yeah, the why. And the why is what's important. And the why is why the recidivism rate is so high, because people don't understand there's a reason that that kid did that. There's a reason that adult did that. Mine was drugs and alcohol. Mine wasn't. I mean, I had like traumas that I've worked through and things like that, but mine was drugs. That's what fueled me to commit crimes. But nobody. Again, that's where I started looking at things. It's never black and white.
Right.
My drugs were the gray area. That's so. Again, I encourage everybody just to kind of take a step, and honestly, that should be something everybody does on a daily basis anyway. If you're in an argument with somebody, take a step back and just try and understand their point of view.
Right.
So, well, is there anything else you want to say to everybody?
I guess just real quick on the trauma piece, like a lot of times these kids, adults, whatever, went through a trauma, don't realize it had any sort of effect on them. So then they just keep going throughout their lives and whatnot. And then we end up again in the justice system and whatnot. So I think it also starts like we need to educate just that trauma can affect people. And I think it could be very simple, started in schools and whatnot, but that'll ever happen.
Well, let's not change curriculum. Everybody needs algebra. So, well, Danielle, I greatly appreciate you coming on. This was fantastic. If you work with anybody that wants to come on and kind of give their take on what's going on in the system, I would greatly appreciate it. I think the listeners would. I kind of want to shed light on, like I said, everybody's perspective over the whole issue. So I appreciate you. I thank you. I'm glad you were part of my sister's live. I know she loves you. She talks very highly of you. So I'm sure I will see you around her house at some point, and keep doing what you're doing. I thank you, and I appreciate you for doing what you're doing. I think it's great. I think it's very admirable. And just keep doing it.
Thanks.
So, all right, I will talk to you.
Okay.
All right, bye.